Good evening. I'm Margaret Iacono, Assistant Curator at the Frick Collection and the organizing curator of the current exhibition, Vermeer, Rembrandt, and Hall's Masterpieces of Dutch Painting from the Mauritshuis. I'd like to welcome all of you here in our audience, as well as those of you watching us live via our webcast, which is made available on our website and the Frick Collections channel on Fora TV. And before we begin, I'd kindly like to ask you to turn off your mobile phones. Tonight, it is my honor to introduce Edwin Buijsen, Head of Collections at the Royal Picture Gallery Mauritshuis in The Hague. Edwin studied art history at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In 2008, he was appointed Head of Collections at the Mauritshuis. In this role, he oversees the department responsible for the preservation and management of the museum's collection, the art historical and technical research on works in the collection, and the compilation and organization of exhibitions. Before assuming his current position at the Mauritshuis, Edwin was working as curator of research and technical documentation at the Netherlands Institute for Art History, also known as the RKD. He has been involved in the realization of the Rembrandt database, a joint initiative of the RKD and the Mauritshuis, supported by the Museums and Art Conservation Program of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. The Frick is also a participant in this important project, which provides researchers with an overview of existing information and documentation on Rembrandt's paintings. Edwin has written numerous books and articles on Dutch painting and drawing from the 15th to the 18th century. His past subjects include Paulus Potter, Jan van Goyen, and of particular interest to the present exhibition, Rembrandt and Vermeer. Currently, he is doing a study on the Dutch 17th century painter and poet, Adriaan van de Venne. I had the pleasure of working closely with Edwin during the installation of the pictures from the Mauritshuis. His knowledge of the paintings and his concern that they be presented in the best possible manner was inspiring to all of us involved in the undertaking. Edwin, like his fellow staff members at the Mauritshuis, has been extremely collegial and supportive through all stages of the exhibition. Working with them here in New York, in The Hague, and in our many conversations in cyberspace has been a true delight. Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring is, of course, the centerpiece of this exhibition, but we are also thrilled to have 14 other iconic pictures from the Mauritshuis on view in our galleries for visitors to enjoy. Tonight, Edwin will explore some of these other extraordinary paintings, as well as additional ones from the Mauritshuis collection, as he takes us behind the scenes of everyday life, Dutch genre painting. Please join me in welcoming Edwin Buijsen.
Thank you very much for this introduction. And I can say that it's really been a pleasure to work together with the Frick, and that we at the Mauritshuis are most honored and pleased to have our paintings here at this wonderful museum. When we were talking about having a traveling exhibition and let it go to New York, the Frick collection was the most obvious choice for us. It was really the first choice, because both museums, Mauritshuis and the Frick collection, have much in common. They're both small collections with almost all masterpieces, and they are exhibited in a building which was designed as a house to live in. So they have a very intimate atmosphere, and that's why our paintings they do it so well here at the Frick. 2 weeks ago, my director, Emily Goordenker, gave a lecture in this same room on the history of the building and the collection of the Mauritshuis. Tonight, I want to focus on a special topic related to Dutch 17th century painting, a topic which has my special interest. And that's genre painting, and specifically the hidden meanings in genre paintings of the Dutch 17th century. The paintings which I show you in this lecture are in the collection of the Mauritshuis, unless stated otherwise. One of the main characteristics of Dutch 17th century painting is the almost obsessive attention to the everyday things of life. In this panoramic view of the picturesque countryside around Haarlem, painted by Jacob van Ruisdael, we see long strips of white linen which have been laid out to dry. Linen bleaching was an important industry in the vicinity of Van Ruisdael's native city of Haarlem, and therefore very much part of everyday life. And if we look closely, we can see tiny figures doing their daily work in the fields. The Goldfinch by Carl Fabricius shows a single bird chained to its feeding box against a white wall. There is nothing heroic about the subject, but it is painted so fluently in broad brushstrokes that from a distance it looks like the bird is alive and could move any moment. And that is exactly the effect the painter wanted to achieve with this extraordinary display of illusionism. This still life by Adriaan Coorte, a little-known artist who worked at the end of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century, looks even more unpretentious. In most of his works, Coorte fully concentrates on simple everyday fruit or vegetables set against a dark background. And here, 5 apricots and a branch are carefully arranged on a stone plinth. And that is all. However, the intricate play of light, color and form gives a magical feel to this intimate painting. Dutch 17th century portraits bring us as close to real life as possible. Already in the Golden Age itself, it was often remarked that the only thing that portraits lacked was the breath of life. And in his portrait of an elderly man, Rembrandt has not only captured the features of the sitter, but also his personality. Because the man is portrayed in such an informal manner, it has been assumed that he must have been a close friend of the artist. Unfortunately, we do not know his identity. Besides portraits, Rembrandt also painted stories from the Bible in an uncompromisingly true-to-life way. His depiction of Susanna shows this biblical figure not as the embodiment of ideal beauty, as in Italian art, but as an ordinary Dutch woman who has just taken off her clothes, her legs still showing the marks of her stockings. And you can see this very well in this detail. For Dutch artists, all visible things were worthy of being painted. This is clearly demonstrated by Paulus Potter in his famous bull. This painting of a life-size bull, together with other animals and an old peasant in a Dutch meadow, can best be understood as a praise of rural life. Recently, it has been demonstrated by experts on cattle that the painting is not a portrait of an existing animal, but that it is in fact composed in the artist's studio by using separate studies after several animals of different ages. For instance, the teeth are from an animal of 2 or 3 years, but the outlook of the animal is for a bull of 1 year. The front part doesn't fit well to the back part, and so it was composed out of separate studies into, well, an interpretation of a bull done by the artist. But each detail in itself is carefully studied after nature. The hairs of the bull, the flies hovering over it, and even this detail, the cow dung in the right lower corner, and it's my favorite detail of the painting, is rendered so convincingly that the artist must have studied it and smelled it at close range. A category of painting which is exclusively devoted to everyday life is what we now call genre painting. The French word genre, which literally means sort or type, was first used in the 18th century for all subjects which were not based on stories from the Bible, classical mythology, or written sources. But later on, the word genre became restricted to scenes showing common people engaged in their daily activities. In the 17th century itself, there was no generic term for this kind of paintings, which were then simply named after their specific subject, such as a merry company, a conversation piece, a peasant meal, a brothel scene, or a soldier with a laughing girl. The exhibition at the Frick contains 4 important genre paintings from the collection of the Mauritshuis, each one representing a pictorial theme which enjoyed great popularity in the 17th century. And you see them here in one slide. At the right, on the top, Jan Steen, as the old sing, so pipe the young, one of the largest paintings by Jan Steen, and a fine example of the illustration of a proverb. The painting next to it is the Oyster Eater, also by Jan Steen, the smallest work in his oeuvre, showing a woman as Seductress, or femme fatale. And below, on the on the left, Nicolas Maas, the old lace maker, showing a hard-working woman as a paragon of virtue. And on the left, finally, Gerard ter Borch, a woman writing a letter, an intimate painting devoted to the act of letter writing, a popular pastime in those days, and often associated with love. In this talk, I would like to use these 4 paintings to look behind the scenes of everyday life in search for hidden meanings. But first I want to explain a bit more about Dutch genre painting in general. In genre painting, a rough distinction can be made between what we call low life and high life. Low life scenes, such as this country fair by David Vingboons, show peasants and other country dwellers while feasting, fighting, or just taking it easy, as in this rustic picture by the Haarlem artist Adriaan van Ostade. 17th century paintings with peasants at work are very rare. High life scenes show well-to-do burghers inside their houses, such as this merry company dining and making music by the Delft artist Antoni Palamedes. Or they show people outside, as in this charming inner courtyard by Pieter de Hoog, who also lived in Delft, and left in the background we can see the tower of the new church of Delft. Everyday life had already been depicted in previous centuries, but mostly as part of a religious subject. For instance, the well-known Miro de altarpiece by Robert Campin in the Cloisters, here in New York, shows the Annunciation in a 15th century domestic setting, with in the center the angel and the Virgin Mary in a 15th century interior. And on the right wing, we see Saint Joseph as a carpenter in his workshop, with on the table a mousetrap he has just finished. Another example from the beginning of the 16th century, a small panel attributed to the North Netherlandish painter Jan Mostaert. And we see the interior of a prison with 3 male persons in contemporary dress. That this is not a scene from everyday life, but a biblical story, can only be discovered at close inspection. Above the heads of the 2 sitting persons, we see balloons, like in a comic strip, and these balloons show the dreams of the baker and the cupbearer, which are being explained to them by Joseph, the standing man at the right, while imprisoned by the Egyptian pharaoh. This is a story from the Old Testament, from the book Exodus. Instead of Egypt, the painter situated this Old Testament story in his own time. And the same goes for this painting from the 1530s by an artist called the so-called Brunswick monogramist. We do not know his identity, but he has a nickname. This painting is now in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, but it used to be displayed in the Mauritshuis for some time. The biblical subject of Christ shown to the people by Pilate has been shifted to the back. We see it here. And the foreground is completely devoted to a 16th century market scene with a lot of details from everyday life. And one can imagine that it was an easy step to omit the religious scene altogether, and that is exactly what happened towards the end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th century. This phenomenon can especially be witnessed in paintings showing the biblical parable of the prodigal son. This story, told by Christ in the New Testament, relates how a son of a wealthy man spent his inheritance on wine, food, gambling, and loose women. For artists, this was a good excuse to show a brothel scene, as in this painting by the Flemish artist Jan van Hemesse from 1536, now in the Royal Museum in Brussels. In the background are small scenes from the same story, showing that is indeed the prodigal son. But later on, such references to the parable of the prodigal son disappeared, and what remained was a general image of misbehavior, as in this painting in the Amsterdam Rijksmuseum by David Vinkboons from the beginning of the 17th century. It shows a garden party with young people making music, dancing, and making love. And at the right, you see it here, an elegantly dressed young man is lying on the ground while his head rests on the lap of his female companion. This could be the prodigal son, but we're not sure about it, and there is no reference to the biblical story at all. But the scene itself clearly stems from this pictorial tradition, but has developed into a theme of its own. Pure genre paintings, without any religious scenes, first occurred in the southern Netherlands in the second half of the 16th century, especially in the work of Peter Bruegel the Elder. And I show you here the famous peasant wedding in the museum in Vienna. Genre painting was introduced in the northern Netherlands, which would soon become the Dutch Republic, by artists who fled from the southern Netherlands to cities as Haarlem and Amsterdam. And David Vinkboons, of whom I just showed you the garden party, was one of these artists coming from the south. For a long time, genre paintings were considered by art historians as realistic depictions of everyday life. However, nowadays it is generally accepted that genre scenes often contain a moralizing message on how to behave. Unlike modern art lovers, 17th century viewers were used to attach deeper meanings to images. And this becomes apparent from Emblem books, a category of mainly didactic illustrated books, which were highly popular in 17th century Holland. And you see here an example from a book by Jacob Cats, in Dutch called Spiegel van een oude en de nieuwe tijd, Mirror of the Old and the New Times, a collection of proverbs, published in 1632. These books were filled with so-called emblems, and each emblem or emblema consisted of 3 parts. A motto or inscriptio, and here it reads, it zijn sterke benen die wilde dragen konnen. Translated, it are strong legs which are able to carry wealth. Then you have the image or the pictura, and finally the explanation or subscriptio. The mottos were often general sayings or proverbs which were illustrated, sometimes literally, in the images, and that's what you see here. You see a young man carrying a woman who is in fact wealth, and in the back you see him collapsing under her weight. And the scene is further explained in the poem below, which explains that the man is complaining. At first, he says, the lady on my back was very light, but she became heavier and heavier, and I cannot bear it anymore. And of course, the message is clear: you have to be strong to be able to, to carry wealth. Otherwise, if you don't do it, you will end up poor again. The popularity of emblem books reflects the general taste of those days. They are educating and amusing at the same time. Or as the Dutch say, tot lering en vermaak, for education and enjoyment. And the author of this book, Jacob Cats, and you see here a portrait by him, by Adriaan van de Venne, the artist I'm doing research on. And Adriaan van de Venne was the illustrator of almost all books by Jacob Cats, and he also designed the emblem I just showed you. Almost everyone in the Dutch Republic who could read had one or more books of Cats on his bookshelf. The saying, for education and enjoyment, also applies to many Dutch paintings with genre scenes. They have the purpose to entertain and educate the viewer by showing either the good or the bad example. In other words, how to behave or how not to behave. Needless to say that the bad example was the most popular among painters and their audience, because it was much more fun to look at, while the good example is always a bit boring. Showing the bad example, however, should urge people to follow the good example. Sometimes there is a close relationship between a genre painting and an emblem. In this painting by Gottfried Schalke, we see an elegantly dressed young lady who lifts the lid of a box so that a small bird can escape. And you see it here, the bird just peeping out of the box. The young girl does not listen to the old woman at the right, who has her finger raised in warning. A very similar scene can be witnessed in this emblem by Jacob Cats, which bears the Latin motto, reperire perire est. Cats also gives the Dutch equivalent, het vlucht, krijg het lucht, freely translated, there it goes, it flies away. In the explanation below, it is written that the young girl in the image is about to lose her virginity to a young man. Her old wet nurse, standing in the door in the background, warns her for this, saying, "Child, keep the lid on the box, because it contains your virginity." But alas, the box is opened and the bird escapes. And you see that happening here. In the painting by Schalke, the same is about to happen. The smiling young lady does not pay attention to the old woman next to her, whose wisdom is underscored by the book she is carrying. And in the left background, here, we can see a statue of a satyr, which represents lust. And this painting has a companion piece, also made by Gottfried Schalke, which shows how the story ends. The same young woman is now weeping because she is confronted with the consequences of her foolish behavior. While a boy at the right is making an obscene gesture, a doctor is conducting a kind of 17th century pregnancy test. It was thought at the time that by looking at the color of a woman's urine, one could determine if she was pregnant. To stress that this is indeed the case, the painter has depicted a very tiny child inside the glass bowl. So with the help of the emblem by Cats, we can discover the moralistic message of Schalken's painting with the young woman letting the bird out of the box. Young girls, beware, for your virginity is easily lost. However, it's not always this easy. Paintings which closely resemble emblems are rare. Trying to find out what lies behind scenes of everyday life is often like a detective story. You have to search for clues and try to interpret these clues by looking at the circumstantial evidence. An object can have various meanings, depending on the context in which it appears. For instance, in a religious setting, a bunch of grapes can refer to the wine in the Last Supper, and therefore to the blood of Christ. But in family portraits, it may allude to fertility, and in merry companies to abundance and extravagance. Now I would like to invite you to look behind the scenes of everyday life by discussing the 4 genre paintings in the exhibition and compare them with other paintings showing the same themes. In this painting by Jan Steen, we see 3 generations of a family enjoying themselves with food, wine, and making music. A cheerful woman holds up her glass to be filled with wine. On the table are lying grapes, oysters, and a lemon. The key to the interpretation of this scene can be found on the sheet of music held by the grandmother. If we zoom in, we can read the following text in translation: "As the old sing, so pipe the young." This was and still is a popular proverb in the Netherlands, meaning the example given by grown-ups will be copied by the young ones. And that is exactly what happens in this painting. At the right, a broadly grinning man teaches a young boy to smoke a pipe. He gives the bad example because smoking was considered a bad thing even in those days. And it also refers to the Dutch word pijpen, to pipe, in the proverb, which means copycat piping, but also to smoke a pipe. The older boy behind them is playing the bagpipes, also a pun to the word pipe. This instrument had many bad connotations, such as laziness. At the left sits a parrot, a bird well known for its abilities to imitate, so also to copy bad behavior. Another detail. The laughing old man, you could say the granddad, wears a so-called new father's cap, usually worn by the father at the baptism of a child. To his right, we see indeed an infant, but the man seems much too old to be the father, another sign that in this painting things are not as they should be. So far it is all pretty straightforward, but how far should we go in interpreting details? Is this just a nail in the wall, or does it have a deeper meaning? Let us compare with a similar painting by Jan Steen in the museum in Montpellier in France, which shows almost the same composition. There too, a nail is sticking out of the wall, but this time a key is hanging on it. We see this more often in paintings by Jan Steen, a key on a nail in the wall. Probably this is the key to the storage room or the store cupboard. And it hangs high so that the children cannot reach it. The fact that in our painting the key is missing may be understood as a further indication that this is a very chaotic household. Another detail, the small foot stove or foot warmer on which the lady is resting her foot. Does it have a deeper meaning, or is it just an object from everyday life? We can compare this with an emblem which shows a foot stove and the motto Mignon des Dames, which is French for sweetheart of the ladies. The explanation compares the foot stove to the male lover who tries to win the affections of a lady by doing everything she wants and thus becomes her slave. Could the foot stove in the painting by Steen have a similar meaning? We're not sure about it. And what to think of these beautiful painted details? A bottle, a beer glass, and a stone jug. Could they have a meaning as well, or are they just objects of everyday life? And this remains unsolved. We simply do not know. Jan Steen often painted proverbs. Another example is this one: a pig belongs in the sty. In other words, who behaves badly shall be treated as such. And this is illustrated by a drunken woman wearing torn clothes who is pushed by other drunkards towards a pigsty at the lower left. A boy stands at the ready to throw water at her or something else, to sober her up or to mock her. Again, the bad example, to urge us to not to do this. Proverbs are often easy to recognize, but also when Jan Steen did not choose a well-known proverb, the moralistic message is often made pretty clear by the inclusion of many clues, as in this painting. At first, what strikes us is the curtain, which is raised, and that functions as a kind of a stage curtain. This is not just a scene from everyday life, but it is staged like in a play, like a theatrical performance. The setting is the interior of an inn, where people are amusing themselves with eating, drinking, making music, and gambling. Again, let us look at some details. An old man is offering an oyster to a much younger woman. The oyster was and still is considered an aphrodisiac, food that arouses sexual desire. However, the man is much older than the woman. They are an ill-matched couple. And behind them is a hunchback violinist violinist who tries to tune his instrument, but he doesn't seem to succeed. In the 17th century, music and love were often compared. In both, one has to obtain harmony. And harmony, that's what is lacking here, because they do not fit with each other. And the couple at the right is evenly matched, and you can see them here. The two younger ones, they are evenly matched, and they are making harmonious music together. Furthermore, we see a young boy trying to teach a cat how to dance. Also, a funny detail, and that shows that doing things that you're not supposed to do. And in Dutch, we have a saying which goes, kattenkwaad uithalen. I don't know how to translate it. It's doing evil like a cat, but this is something you're really not supposed to do. And we see also a head, a symbol of dignity, which is cast aside on the tile floor. So someone has lost his dignity. In the background, several men are playing a game of chance. You see it here, also behavior which is to be disapproved. That this painting shows the bad example is underscored by a detail that is easily overlooked. And I'll go back to the painting as a whole again, and look here on the attic, and I'll show you in a minute a detail. In the attic, a boy is lying there blowing soap bubbles with a skull beside him. And this refers to a well-known pictorial motif that was called homo bulla. The life of man is like a soap bubble. And this was often personified by a puto blowing bubbles and sitting on a skull, as in this print by Hendrik Goltzius from the end of the 16th century. And the inscription reads, quis evadit, who will escape death? When we return to the detail again, the message is clear. Life is like a soap bubble. It looks beautiful, it looks great, but it contains nothing. And when it explodes, it's all gone. And that awaits you. That's the skull besides the boy. So, spend your precious time on earth well and do not misbehave like the people in this picture. In this small painting by Jan Steen, his smallest ever, the message is less obvious. An attractive young girl sprinkles salt on an oyster, which she seems to offer to us with a sweet smile. Again, the oyster is understood to be an aphrodisiac. And Jacob Cats, the popular author whom I already introduced to you, called oysters love potions, minnekruiden in Dutch. The girl sprinkles salt on it to spice it up, making it even more arousing, because salt was also considered to be an aphrodisiac. Behind the girl, two servants are busy in the kitchen preparing more oysters, and at the right we see a curtained bed. To shed more light on its deeper meaning, it is useful to compare this painting by Jan Steen with three works by another artist, Frans van Mieris, who lived in the Dutch city of Leiden at the same time as Jan Steen. Here we see the first of these three paintings, all in the Mauritshuis. Also a small painting, like the girl eating oysters, with an arched top. And we see a man smiling, offering oysters on a silver plate to a richly dressed woman. The woman willingly accepts, while her open jacket reveals her décolleté, which indicates that she is also receptive to other offers from the man. The blush on her cheeks is perhaps caused by the glass of wine she holds in her left hand, or by the offer made to her by the man, and the curtained bed in the background is undoubtedly the place where this encounter will end. By the way, the man and woman in this painting resemble the painter Frans van Mieris and his wife, but they are not depicted as themselves, but as actors in a play. And Jan Steen did the same thing in many of his works, including the already discussed As the Old Sing, So Pipe the Young. Another painting by Frans van Mieris, a man and a woman with two dogs, also known as Teasing the Pet. Again, both men and women engaged in an intimate scene. This time the oysters are lacking, but there are other clues. On the table lies a lute, and I already explained that making music was often compared with making love. The man, who again has the same features as in the previous painting, and most likely is the painter himself, pulls the ear of the little dog in the woman's lap, while another dog is barking at him. The dog, especially a lap dog, was a well-known symbol of marital fidelity, and we see it often as such in family portraits. The teasing of the dog on the woman's lap might therefore indicate that the woman's fidelity is challenged by someone other than her husband. She pushes her suitor away, but in my opinion, not very convincingly. The third painting by Frans van Mieris leaves little to the imagination. Again, a man in a woman, but in a different setting. A voluptuous young woman pours wine in a glass held up by a young man. The man is certainly receptive to what she has to offer, because he grabs her apron to pull her closer. On the wall hangs a lute, which again can be understood as a reference to love. And in the doorway, in the back, here, another woman bargains with a man, while a candle is placed behind the little window. The bed linen hanging over the wooden balcony provides another clue. And if we would still have any doubt about what is going on here, one detail reveals it all. Behind the couple in the foreground, we see two dogs which are copulating. And by the way, this detail was painted out in the 19th century, when it was thought to be indecent, and it was only revealed after restoration in the mid-20th century. In the 17th century, a painting like this was called a brothel piece, and we can understand why. However, many paintings of a man and a woman drinking a glass of wine are not so explicit and leave much to the viewer's imagination. In this painting by Vermeer, which you all know so well because it's here in the Frick collection, we see a young woman smiling charmingly and making an inviting gesture to the officer, who is seen on the back, and strikes a macho pose with his arm akimbo. The body language of the two figures leaves enough room for speculation, but it is difficult to attach a specific meaning to this scene. It does not look like a brothel, because the lady is properly dressed, but there is certainly love in the air. Let us now return to the Oyster Eater by Jan Steen. An important difference with all the paintings I just discussed is that the young woman is not accompanied by a man. However, from the way she looks out of the picture and the gesture with which she is presenting the oyster, it can be deduced that in fact she is trying to seduce the viewer, that is the male viewer, to follow her to the curtained bed in the background. So the woman here as a seductress. As I already mentioned, scenes with people misbehaving or with people trying to provoke indecent conduct, as in the Oyster Eater, were popular among 17th century painters and their public. However, there are also a few works showing the good example, such as this Old Lace Maker by Nicolaas Maas, one of Rembrandt's pupils. The woman in this small painting is making bobbin lace, you can see that here. She is fully concentrated on her work. The table next to her contains several household attributes: earthenware pots and jugs, some kindling, and a bundle of twigs, which may be used for cleaning. Beneath the table appears to be some kind of storage facility, of which the lid opens at the front. At the doorpost hangs a sieve, and to the woman's right, a basket of eggs. The floor is clean and all is tidy. This is a neat household. What the painter shows us is an example of a woman who has devoted all her life to household and can therefore be considered a paragon of virtue, a paragon of virtue, the good example. This painting by Gerard ter Borch really shows the ideal woman according to 17th century standards. The cradle stresses her role as a mother. The needlework she's doing was traditionally associated with diligence, domesticity, and therefore virtue. But she is also head of the household, as is indicated by the maid in the background, who does the dirty work, in this case, cleaning the fireplace. Another work by the same artist, Gerard ter Borch, shows a mother combing the hair of her child. This moving image of motherly care again shows a virtuous woman. The combing of the hair is not just a sign of order and cleanness, the main characteristics of a good housewife, but it may also refer to the cleaning of the mind from impure thoughts, and such a meaning is associated with combs in some 17th century emblems. Therefore, this woman is the opposite of the mother in Jan Steen's painting as the old sing so pipe the young, because she gives a proper education to her child. Another example by Judith Leister, one of the very few female painters of the 17th century. She was probably a pupil of Frans Hals. This painting by Judith Leister shows a young woman fully engaged in her needlework, while lit by candlelight. A bearded man grasps her at the shoulder and seems to offer her money, and the shadow which he casts on the wall gives him a menacing appearance. It may be suspected that this man, who appears to be much older than the woman, is trying to buy her love. However, different from the ladies in the paintings by Van Mieris, which I discussed earlier, the girl neglects the man completely and continues with her work. It's like in the Beatles song, "Money Can't Buy Me Love." It has been argued by art historians that the very positive image of the woman in this painting could be linked to the fact that the artist was female. However, virtuous women were also painted by male artists at the time, like Nicolaas Maas and Gerard ter Borch, as I showed you before. The fourth genre painting in the exhibition that I would like to discuss with you poses more of a puzzle than the other three. Here, Gerard ter Borch shows us a lovely young lady with a pearl earring who is writing a letter. The oriental rug has been pushed aside to create a flat surface on which she can write. The paper has already been folded, and there appear to be letters below her pen. So perhaps she's making corrections to the letter already written. Unfortunately, we cannot read the text, so we are not sure about its contents. The act of letter writing was a popular pastime in those days for both men and women. Letters were the most important means of communication, also for matters of the heart. And we see this here in two paintings by Gabriel Metsu, two companion pieces, not in the Mauritshuis, but in the National Gallery of Ireland in Dublin. And on the left, a young man is writing a letter, and on the right, a young woman is reading a letter in the company of her maid. And because these two paintings belong together, we may suspect that the man is writing a letter to his beloved one, the girl on the right, and that she is the one reading it, receiving it. But there's more about this painting, because we see that the woman is accompanied by her maid, and the maid is not looking at her, she has the envelope here. The lady itself is reading the letter, and the maid is revealing a painting on the wall. She pulls away the curtain, which hangs in front of it. The fact that it's covered by a curtain is not unusual. Paintings in 17th century interiors were known to be sometimes protected by a curtain from light and from dust. But her gesture here has a meaning, because what she is revealing is a seascape. And we see a ship on the water, and it's getting a bit rough. We see some waves here, and in the 17th century, a ship on the water was often compared with the ship of love. And there are several emblems in emblem books which have that particular meaning. And if the water is smooth, everything is all right with love. But if a storm is approaching and the water becomes rough, and that's what happens here, things are not so good. So we can make up our own story. The man has written a letter, perhaps to end the affair, and the woman is concerned about its contents, and the maid already knows what's in it, because she probably has read the letter when it arrived. Here you see it in better detail. Here the letter, the envelope, and the painting on the wall. Beautiful painting by Gabriel Metsu. This is a painting by Johannes Vermeer called The Love Letter in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And we see a comparable scene. A lady here playing a lute, again, perhaps a reference to love. She has received a letter and she's looking a bit frightened to the maid behind her, and from the glance of the maid we can suspect that she knows the contents of the letter. And behind her is again a seascape with a very cloudy one. Storm is approaching, probably not good news in the letter from the lover of the lady. And this painting here in the Frick collection, a comparable scene, but there are not that many clues in it, so we have to use our imagination about what's happening here. We see a young girl and she's writing a letter. She has laid down her pen, probably writing to her lover, but receiving a letter at the same time. And she's making a gesture, and this is as emotional as Vermeer gets. It shows that she's a bit frightened about what could be in the letter. And the maid here probably knows already the contents. There's no painting in the background, so this is all we have. But it's enough if you are aware of other paintings with the same subject and with the same kind of meaning, such as the ones by Metsu. It's not that difficult to make up your own story. And if we return to the painting by Gerard ter Borch, there are also a few clues. The lady is writing a letter. It's a beautiful lady. Perhaps it's a love letter. There's no reference to a lover, only the bed in the background. That may be an allusion to love, but we're not sure about it. And this is typical for paintings from the second half of the 17th century, it's open-ended. We can use our own imagination to finish the story. And again, it follows a pictorial tradition of girls writing love letters or receiving love letters, but it's not a clear-cut story. In this talk, I've only been able to lift a tip of the curtain to show you what is behind the scenes of everyday life in Dutch 17th century genre paintings. There's much more to be said about it, and also art historians are not in agreement with each other. I already told you that until, I think it was the 50s, 60s of the previous century, art historians thought, well, genre paintings are just depictions of everyday life, very realistic. Then it was discovered there was a meaning behind it, and in the 70s and 80s, art historians went too far and recognized a symbolical meaning in almost every detail. And then there was another reaction, a new generation of art historians saying, well, no, there's no meaning at all in these paintings. So it's kind of going back and forth, but I think that especially in the beginning of the 17th century, there is often a specific meaning to these paintings. At the end of the 17th century, in the second half, it's more open-ended, and artists play with the pictorial traditions, with the themes they are depicting. When, for instance, ter Borch shows a girl writing a letter, he knows that the people who will be viewing the painting, his contemporaries, are aware of the pictorial traditions of love letters and showing love letters in these paintings. Finally, I have to add that the sublime technique used to execute these paintings and the almost perfect rendering of realistic details will also have contributed to the viewer's pleasure and to the popularity of such paintings, which are still being admired by us today. So again, it's for education, but also for enjoyment. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? I'll be most willing to answer questions if you have them. Yes? There. Oh, you asked, is there a reason why genre paintings were so popular in the Netherlands? Is that right? do with, can you all hear me when I'm standing here? Yes. It has to do with the fact that different from other countries, France and Italy, nobility and royalty were no longer important patrons of the arts, but it were the burghers. And they bought paintings to be hung in their own houses. And they preferred subjects which were very close to their everyday life experience. And that's why we see themes like still lifes, like genre paintings, but also portraits, very popular, and other themes like history paintings, scenes from the Bible, classical mythology, less important in the 17th century. And by choosing these genre scenes, well, there's a immediate link with what they're doing in their household. So I think that has to do.
In several of these paintings, there is canopy bed in the dining room. Yes. Is this just symbolic, or was that the lifestyle back then?
Both. And that is what makes it so difficult. We know that there were often more beds in a household, not only in the bedroom, but also in other rooms. So it's difficult to tell if you see a bed in a certain scene, if it has a symbolical meaning, if it's a sexual reference, or if it's just a detail from everyday life. And that very much depends on the context in which the bed is appearing. And for instance, with Oyster Theater by Jan Steen, it's I think very obvious because of the oysters and other references to love. But in other paintings, like the painting by Theatricality, it's less obvious. So it's both, it's our details from everyday life, but they might have a deeper symbolical meaning. Yes.
Does it know whether it's commission?
The question is it known if these paintings were commissioned? Most of these paintings were not commissioned. They were painted for the free market, but some painters, like Frans van Mieris and another artist, were so popular that their paintings were bought by collectors before they were even painted. But it was the artist who decided the subject, and not the person who bought. But most often these paintings were painted on spec for the free market and not on commission.
Sort of to that point, I think one of the things that makes these so compelling for me is the thought that the activities being portrayed are things that the viewer, contemporary viewer, would relate to. And so I think I'm just curious to what extent you think these painters had in mind an appeal to as many people as possible in order to get the viewer to connect with the message.
Yes. To rephrase your question, let's see. Did painters have in mind that a large audience would be receptive for the paintings, not particular persons, but a large audience? I think yes. And what you often see, and especially also in the painting like the one by Theatricality, is that it can be understood on different levels. So if you look at a painting, you see a very nice painting of a lady in the room. But you can also look further, and that depends on the intellectual capacities of the viewer and his eagerness to find the symbolical meaning. So I think really, and you see that in the end of the 17th century even more, that these paintings can be interpreted on several levels depending on the person who is looking at it. And that also enables artists to invite a large audience to appreciate them. So people would say, well, now, moralistic message is a bit old-fashioned, but also it could appeal to people who really thought it was important that painting had a message in it.
One of the paintings you showed, the pregnant lady, the kid was making a pretty crude sign of intercourse, and also in the benches of Franz Hals has a similar crude sign. Is that criticized at the time by some people, or was that considered completely appropriate in a, say,
let us say, people are saying, well, the question is, was it appropriate to include such details, such coarse details as the gesture in the painting by Schalking? Well, I don't think there was that much criticism. People were used to these kind of jokes and thought it was really funny. And even people with a high level of education could appreciate once in a while such a joke. And there was another
other moral standard than in our century. And I think it was in the 19th century, the Victorian age, that this kind of jokes became, well, not done, indecent. But in the 17th century, well, you also see a lot of paintings, landscapes, for instance, also genre scenes with people doing their peeing or the other thing. That's also something which was followed kind of a joke. And what often happened in the 19th century, these were painted out. Like the detail of the Frans van Mieris painting, no one in the 17th century took any offense to it, but in the 19th century it was considered to be indecent.
In the painting of the girl, she seemed to be very expensive, luxurious clothing, which indicates to me that she was of a higher class of society. So would that have worked if her was making such a seductive, inappropriate offer?
The question is, the girl in the painting of Jan Steen, presenting the oyster to us, has a dress of clothing which looks very expensive, indeed it is, and is that in accordance to what she is doing there. We see more often in the paintings of Jewish women that they are dressed richly dressed. So that is not so unusual. And well, even ladies which wear these costumes can perform indecent behavior. That's often the case. You see it also, for instance, in the painting I showed by Frans van Mieris. There's some of them that, especially also the men offering oysters to the woman. The woman is also has a décolleté, but her dress is very rich. Well, it seems to indicate a certain rank.
Why do you consider religion was put out but not the other?
Very good question. Why do I think religion was put out but not the other? I think it has to do with the fact that the 17th century Dutch Republic was Protestant. And Protestants, well, if you have visited the Protestant church, there are no images of religious scenes. While religious scenes in the 15th, 16th century had a deeper meaning, you see a change in the 17th century that parties do not depict religious scenes anymore, but they instead depict scenes from everyday life, but with the same kind of moralistic message. I think that really has to do with Protestant faith, that you're looking at your own environment and trying to find moralistic lesson in it as well. So sometimes even religious, but they do not depict religious scenes at all.
You mentioned that the close correlation between the Emblem books.
Yes.
Were those ever translated into English, or was that only something predictive?
Well, yeah, the question is, were Emblem books translated into English? Well, in fact, Emblem books were popular all over Europe. It came from Italy, but they were often published in their own language. But some of the books by Jacob Cats were published in different languages. But they were especially very popular in Holland in the 17th century. They really appealed to 17th century market.
Are they still read in Holland today?
No. Well, Emblem books are not read anymore by the general public, but by art historians and especially also literal historians.
For example, in high school.
No, Jacob Cats is not read anymore. I think he's very, very old-fashioned.
Is there any way to estimate how many households would be able to have art of this nature in them?
Yes. The question is it possible to estimate how many households would have had these kind of paintings? Well, the paintings I showed you are paintings of the highest quality, but there was a large output in the 17th century of paintings also of lesser quality. And what we see is that these kind of subjects were also painted by artists, by lesser artists, and for an audience which could not afford a painting by Van Mieris, but could afford a copy of the Van Mieris or a painting by an imitator. And in the 17th century, a lot of people had paintings. There are descriptions of travelers, people from abroad who visit the Dutch Republic and say, well, I have seen paintings with ordinary craftsmen. I've seen paintings in the houses of peasants. Almost everyone has painted. If that's really true, we do not know, but what we do know is there were a lot of people who owned paintings, but paintings of different qualities. So these same kind of subjects could be painted by various artists. And if you're rich, you bought a painting by Van Mieris, and if you didn't have that much money, you bought a similar painting by a lesser known and less qualified artist. But really, everyone, almost everyone in the Dutch Republic had one or more paintings. Yes? One more question?
Emblem books were highly symbolic.
Yes.
Like the iconography by Shevlin, for example. While here, the teaching is through some kind of realistic image of what happens. How do you explain this concept?
Well, the question is, Emblem books are always highly symbolic, but here the example I showed you shows
Here you have a realistic language.
realistic language, and that's also typical for Dutch 17th century, that authors translated it to their own situation. And when you compare it to Italian emblem books, they're often very allegorical, very abstract. And 17th century writers like Jacob Cats translated these abstract ideas into their own environment, their own surroundings, to make it more appealing to the general public. And that's also a difference, that Italian emblem books are for a very small group and elite, and Dutch emblem books are for a very large group.